So for learning science, we need to finish genetics. We need to then do ecology quickly, and we may get to motion and machines as well.
Can we get big stuff?
In like 3 weeks, so we got a lot to do. You'll notice I did put up on the board your final exam dates. They are in class on June 6th, June 7th, which is a Friday, and June 10th, which is a Monday. On June 7th, you'll have part 1 of your test. It's multiple choice. Yes, you have school that day. It's just going to be in class. On the 10th, the Monday, you'll take the short answer section.
Do we take the same one as the non-accelerants?
Nope. Nope, because yours will cover all the material we've done in class the whole year, including the 8th grade units. Matthew?
Are we doing build stuff?
No. All right, ready? Let's talk about genetics. So first off, much of what we talk about is going to focus around chromosomes. And as we've already learned, where do you find chromosomes? In cells. Where in the cell?
In the nucleus.
In the nucleus, that's right. Okay? They're in the nucleus of most cells. In all organisms, I shouldn't say it. All eukaryotes have chromosomes inside of the nucleus. And they're important because they contain what? Genes. Genetic information. They are made of what? What? You said? What?
DNA.
DNA. They're made of DNA and protein wound together. Okay? They're basically the instructions to your cells about how to build you and how you work. Every single cell's DNA has all the instructions to build you as a person. In this one molecule, this DNA molecule, has the codes that make you who you are. That's why identical twins look identical, because they have identical DNA. They're the same chromosomes. And the chromosomes are what are passed on from parents to their offspring. Half of your chromosomes came from your mother and half come from your father.
Is that like exactly half?
Yep. Now, we talked about it before in humans. How many chromosomes?
46.
46. They come in 23 pairs. And that is a number that's just sort of, it is what it is. It doesn't mean anything, the number. Cats, for example, have 34 chromosomes, 17 pairs. How about goldfish, what do you think?
96.
94.
Ah, so close.
Why do goldfish have more than
They just do. The reason I put goldfish up there is because I don't want you to think the number of chromosomes doesn't mean anything. Doesn't mean they're bigger, more complex, smarter. Doesn't mean anything. It just is. Just what that's what the number they have. Okay?
Can you have an odd number of chromosomes?
Not really. I mean, an individual could have an odd number, but overall, species always have even numbers because during reproduction, those chromosomes split from the gametes. Matthew?
What if they self-reproduce?
What's that?
What if they self-reproduce?
They do reproduce. They copy themselves when cells are divided. So when one cell splits into 2 cells, each chromosome makes a copy of itself, and then each cell gets one of those copies. And what happens is one procedure, one tool that doctors generally use is something called a karyotype. And a karyotype is a test in which they take a picture of the chromosomes inside of a person's cell. Now, depending on when you take the picture, this is what the chromosomes look like sometimes, these X's. Each one is one chromosome. Other times they're only single-stranded. But what they do is they take that picture. Nowadays they use a computer, but they used to actually take a picture and physically with scissors cut out each chromosome and sort them and put them together and arrange them from largest to smallest. Okay? A karyotype is a map or a diagram of someone's chromosomes. And the finished karyotype might look something like this. They're put in order. You can see that for each size chromosome, there's 2 of them. They come in pairs. Thank you. And the pairs are the same size, they have the same banding patterns when they're stained. This one's bent over and this one's bent, that doesn't matter. It just wasn't straight when they took this picture. So they arrange them from 1 down to the 23rd, the smallest chromosomes, put them in order, and then they can look at them. Okay? So 23 of these chromosomes came from each parent. Okay?
Why is number 20 X, no, not X and Y, like?
Yeah, so what happens over here? We'll talk
Okay, I
about
got
that. Okay, what is it?
Oh, that's the gender.
Yeah, those are what we call the sex chromosomes, and they determine the gender of an individual. There are 2 sex chromosomes a person can inherit from their parents, an X chromosome and a Y chromosome. So in this person, a person got an X chromosome. The X chromosome is much larger than the Y. The Y chromosome is very small. Now, do you know what sex chromosomes do males have? Nicholas?
The Y?
Well, they have 2. Everyone has 2.
Oh, wait.
Kayla?
So XX.
No? Anyone else? Kimberly?
Is it XY?
It's XY. Males have XY sex chromosomes. What do females have? Nicholas?
YX?
No. The order is unimportant. Ayla?
YY.
Nope. Only one more option, really. Matthew?
XX.
They have 2 X chromosomes. Alright. Now, if you think about this logically, one of the parents determines the gender of the child. Is it the mother or the father that actually determines the gender? Matthew?
The father?
Father, why?
He says both types of those.
Okay, exactly. Sex is determined by the male. I'll show you that in the next slide. So those are the sex chromosomes. They always are put last on the karyotype. Sometimes they're labeled 23, sometimes they're labeled X and Y. Okay?
Is it possible to get YY?
Nope. And we'll talk about Y in a second. We'll talk about Y, Y.
YY.
Alright, so this is a cell from what? A woman. This is a cell from a male. Let's think about meiosis and what happens. In meiosis, what happens to the number of chromosomes? Remember? Splits it in half. 1 chromosome from each of those 23 pairs goes to each cell. So, after meiosis, new cells are produced. What can the mother give to the new cells? Only an X. That's the only sex chromosome she has. All egg cells have an X chromosome in them. However, in males, when males go through the process of meiosis and produce gametes, what are the possibilities? Right, some of those sperm cells will get the X, others will get the Y, about half and half. So if this sperm cell fertilizes this egg,
It's gonna be a girl.
we would get a girl, 2 X chromosomes. If it fertilizes this one,
It's a girl.
girl. What about if it's this other sperm cell that fertilizes those egg cells?
Boy.
That you get a boy. So what determines the gender is which sperm cell fertilized the egg. Is it a sperm cell carrying an X chromosome or is it a sperm cell carrying a Y chromosome? So why can we not get a YY child? Ayla?
Because the eggs don't contain the Y chromosome.
Exactly. Eggs never contain the Y chromosome. So there's no way it could happen. Yes.
What if somebody like genetically took an egg and opened it up and took out the X chromosome and put a thing?
I don't know. I'm not sure what would happen. There are certain chromosome disorders like Klinefelter syndrome and Turner syndrome where a person can end up with 2 X chromosomes and a Y, or other situations that leads to various problems. Matthew?
What about like transgenders or stuff like that?
What's that?
Like people who are like
Yeah, well, sometimes people are born, babies are born with a variety of abnormalities of the reproductive organs. Some babies are born with both male and female reproductive organs.
So they can reproduce.
No. Almost, as far as I know, they're always infertile because neither ovaries nor testes develop properly. So they still have the organs, but they're not functioning properly. And what will usually happen is at the time of birth, the parents and the doctors in consultation will usually decide, depending on the organs, whether to make that child a boy or a girl. And if they decide on they're going to make it a boy, they will suture up, okay, the vagina. If they decide it's going to be a girl, they'll remove the testes and penis, and then sort of raise that child as either a boy or a girl, depending on what they chose. Every once in a while, sometimes when people have this happens, and people grow up then sometimes, and they feel that their parents chose the wrong gender, that they identify more with male or female when maybe their parents chose the other. Some people argue that the parents and the doctor shouldn't decide either way and should wait until the child grows and develops and then let them choose if they want to do something about it. So just sort of a strange, it's not very common, but it does happen. All right, so these karyotypes I just showed you are made often while the fetus is still growing and developing. Okay? And one of the ways they can do this is by a procedure called an amniocentesis. An amniocentesis, basically a doctor inserts a very long, very thin needle through the mother's abdomen, through the uterus, and into the amniotic sac, and withdraws a sample of this amniotic fluid. That amniotic fluid actually contains cells from the fetus, and they can use those cells to create a karyotype, to look at the chromosomes. They could also maybe do some genetic testing for various diseases that we have genetic tests for. They could check for things like Down syndrome, cystic fibrosis, muscular dystrophy, as well as some other issues.
Wouldn't that puncture the amniotic?
Yeah, the needle is thin enough that it can get in there and not rupture the entire amniotic sac. That it basically, ever since I put like a needle in a balloon and it doesn't actually pop, same sort of idea. There's some flexibility and there's some ways they can do that. And they use ultrasound to make sure that the fetus is not near where they're going to be inserting the needle and so on. That would be bad. All right, now let's look at this karyotype. So normally, the sperm cell carries 23 chromosomes, the egg cell carries 23. After fertilization, the embryo has 46 chromosomes, which is the proper number, and then it grows and develops from there. But every once in a while, a person can be born with an extra chromosome. Okay? It's called non-disjunction, is when the chromosomes don't split properly during sperm production or egg production. And that can lead to one of several chromosome abnormalities. Down syndrome is one of them. Okay? So if you look at this karyotype of this person, this is a person with Down syndrome. Can you see the abnormality in the chromosomes? Kimberly?
It has like a little lump inside.
What's that?
It kind of has like a little lump or a bend inside.
Well, that's just the normal shape. That's actually normal. Sarah? Yes, there's 3 chromosomes here at number 21. Okay? Having that extra chromosome actually presents a series of difficulties in development that are what we associate with the disorder we call Down syndrome. There's 3 21st chromosomes, leads to overproduction of certain proteins because there's an extra chromosome, an extra DNA there. And it leads to some difficulties in the development of digestive organs and the circulatory system, certain physical characteristics that are typical of a person with Down syndrome, developmental delays, things like that. So that extra chromosome has some negative impacts on the child. Is this a boy or a girl?
Boy.
That?
Girl.
And again, this is that extra 21st. There are other chromosome disorders like trisomy 13 is when there's a 13th chromosome. Or I mentioned Klinefelter syndrome or Turner syndrome are caused by an extra sex chromosome.
Does it have to be chromosome 21 that has 3 up to be Down syndrome?
Yes, Down syndrome we only call Down syndrome when it's the extra 21st chromosome. And having an extra chromosome in another place would be a different type of chromosome disorder. Yeah?
So like, If people like are autistic, does that have to do with?
No, autism isn't, there's only sort of not a handful, but more than a handful, but there's not a ton of disease that are caused by actual extra chromosomes. But many diseases have what we call a genetic component, where things like heart disease, or autism, or high blood pressure, or Alzheimer's, certain diseases have a genetic component where some people have a greater likelihood of developing certain diseases because they inherit certain genes from their parents. Okay?
What if the like your parents don't have or nobody else in your family has like autism, and then like you're the first one to have autism? How does that happen?
Because it's not an entire, just like sort of heart disease is the same thing. Like some people have a higher risk of heart disease, but not everybody that gets heart disease has that genetic risk. So there are other factors besides that. Sort of some partially genetic. There's a genetic component, and there's also environmental component, things in development that happen. So it's sort of like, it's not sort of an either or. It could be one of each. It could be some of each. All right, let's just look at a couple examples. We'll do these together. So karyotypes, what do they show us? What is a karyotype? Nicholas?
Chromosomes.
The chromosomes. The chromosomes in a person's cell. All right, is this person on the right a male or female? The Don? How do you know? It's not labeled X or Y.
It only has two X chromosomes.
Yeah, if you look there, they're the same. So there must be XX. And you know by the sex chromosomes. How about this person on the left? Male or female? Ayla?
Male.
That's a male. Again, when you look at 23rd, there's two different chromosomes there, an X and a Y. Is there any genetic abnormality you could see?
Yeah.
What is it, Matthew?
41.
X or 21st chromosome, Down syndrome. All right, any question about karyotypes?
Slow down.
Got that, Lindsay?
No.
David?
So what is it? Can you also tell the gender of the baby by ultrasound?
Sometimes.
Okay, so is it more common for them to do a karyotype?
No, amniocentesis is not done as often because there are risks. Because they are inserting that needle, there are certain risks associated with it. They only generally will do amniocentesis if there's some suspected problem. Sometimes as mothers and fathers get older, they may do amniocentesis to be sure that there are no genetic or chromosomal abnormalities. The risk of some of these things like Down syndrome, the risk rises with the age of the parents. The age of the parents has a significant impact on the likelihood of them having a child with a chromosome abnormality. Lindsay?
You may proceed.
What's that?
You may proceed.
Oh, thank you, Lindsay, for allowing me to proceed. David?
And then I have another question. Okay, I'll get back.
All right. So now let's get to our genetics here. So genetics, when we talk about that, genetics is the study of heredity, of passing on genetic information from parents to offspring. Okay, and this gentleman over here with glasses, his name is Gregor Mendel, who is from Austria, which is not in Australia, although
Europe.
several people, yes, Eastern Europe, several people thought that it was in Australia, but it's not. And we call Mendel the father of genetics. He lived in the 1800s. He was a monk, a religious person, lived in a monastery and get married and so forth. But he was very interested in botany and growing plants, and he did experiments with pea plants. All of his research was with pea plants. And what he did is he crossed pea plants. He bred them together. So we've talked about this, that plants reproduce sexually. Most plants do. And so he would take two different pea plants, breed them together, and look at what the offspring were like. And he kept meticulous records. He observed things like the height of the plants, the seeds, if they're wrinkled or smooth, they're yellow or green, the color of the flowers, all sorts of characteristics in pea plants you could easily observe. And he kept very detailed notebooks and analyzed the results and came up with some conclusions that we know today are still, they still hold true. We still use Mendel's work 150 years later. Okay? Carefully recorded as data. What his conclusion was with pea plants, and it applies to humans as well, is that characteristics in these pea plants were controlled by two different factors. Today we would call those genes, by two genes.
Why is your phone ringing? Turn it off.
It's not really. And he concluded that each of these genes, one came from each parent. So each sex cell
When will I get my test?
contributes one of these factors. Let's focus on our writing so we can move
I'm
on.
grading this test.
You used to be yesterday.
That's okay. You usually have it done by the
I
night.
wasn't even here yesterday.
Whatever. You should still do it. It's not acceptable.
All right. You're a little sassy there.
I'd like to see you grade all of them.
All right, so these sex cells, what's another word for a sex cell? These gametes, each one,
Oh, yeah.
from the male and from the female, each contribute one of those factors to the offspring.
Wait, so is it pollen that delivers the sex cells?
Yeah, we'll go over that. That's the next slide. So how did he actually do this? How do you breed two plants together? Well, plants reproduce sexually. In fact, flowers are the reproductive organs. So you give somebody a bouquet of flowers, you give them a bouquet of reproductive organs.
You guys do not eat apples.
All right, so if you have ever had a garden, you grow tomatoes or peas or zucchini or apples, whatever the case may be, all of those things start off as what? As flowers. Okay? They start off as flowers. And flowers, different plants are different. Some flowers have only male reproductive parts. Some flowers have only female. Some have both in one flower. Some have completely separate plants. One plant's all male, one plant's all female. It just depends on the type of plant. But the male reproductive organs in flowers, okay, are the anthers, okay? And at the very end, these are the anthers. If you ever looked at like a tulip or a big flower, you can see in there these little stalks. On the end is sort of an oval area that's sort of powdery looking. Okay, those are the male reproductive organs. They produce pollen. The end of that is pollen. Lately, the last week or so, you may notice huge amounts of pollen on like your driveway, yellow stuff around the cars in your driveway. That's pollen. That's basically plant sperm cells. Okay? And plants, one way plants reproduce is by some plants produce huge amounts of pollen, which then blows through the air, and some of those pollen grains land in the female reproductive organs of other flowers, fertilizing them. That's how they reproduce. Obviously, one plant can't go down the lawn to meet another plant,
so many
but that's...
ugly yellow flowers.
Well, there's lots of different types. There's other ways plants have of pollinating. Sometimes insects pollinate plants. But what Mendel did is he used a tiny little paintbrush. And he'd take pollen from the stigma of one plant and place it on from the anther of one plant and place it on the stigma, the female reproductive organ, of another plant. What happens when pollen grains land on that stigma, they start to grow inside. This is the ovary of the plant. And they eventually reach an ovule, which is an egg cell. And when the pollen meets the egg cell, that's fertilization. And then that ovule will grow into what? A seed. A seed is a plant embryo.
Yeah,
So pollen blowing through the wind is one means of reproduction. Other means of reproduction are insects pollinating, visiting one plant, then another to spread pollen. But then, in order for those seeds, after they form, to be dispersed, some plants, like a dandelion, their seeds are on the end of little fluffy things which can blow through the air. A maple tree, its seeds disperse by having one of those little helicopter blades, and they go through the air and they disperse. Other plants like an acorn are a nut, and how do they disperse? An animal eats it, okay? And then eventually it comes out as waste and that spreads. Other plant ovaries develop into delicious foods that people eat. When you eat an apple or a tomato or a cucumber or a strawberry, basically that's the ripened ovary of a plant. And what's inside? Those seeds are little embryos of plants. Yes, you're eating a ripened ovary. That's the facts of life according to plants. Michaela?
So are sunflower seeds like
Yeah, it's a little embryo.
So you're eating a baby?
Baby plant. They have to do often some cross-pollination. Alright, let's move on. You got a question, Nicholas?
You said a plant could have both? Like,
Some do.
so could they fertilize them?
Usually they are adapted. So yes, that's a good question. So can a plant self-fertilize? Self-fertilize actually sort of defeats the purpose of sexual reproduction. Because self-fertilization, you're not increasing the variation of the gene. Generally, most plants have adaptations that they don't allow self-fertilization. Oftentimes, the maturing of the pollen is offset with the maturing of the female parts. So even when this part of the flower releases pollen, the female parts of the flower are not developed yet, so it wouldn't fertilize it. They develop later when another plant is developing pollen, and then they can be cross-fertilized. So anyway, Mendel did all these crosses and carefully looked at the results. So he's told us that 23 chromosomes, if you apply it to humans, we now know 23 chromosomes come from the sperm cell, 23 from the egg cell, with a grand total of 46 in the normal body. Now since Mendel's work, we now know that the factors he talked about, one of which came from each parent, we now call them genes. A gene is what Mendel called a factor. And for our purposes this year, we're going to simplify things. And later on in AP Bio, we'll talk about more advanced genetics. But we're going to talk about simple genetics this year. We're going to say that most characteristics come in two forms: dominant and recessive. The dominant form of the gene is sort of like the stronger form. It's the one that kind of can show through. It overtakes the opposite, the recessive form. That's sort of the weaker form. We're going to use letters to symbolize these genes. And whenever we use a letter for a dominant gene, we always use a capital letter. For example, if I'm thinking about pea plants, I'm thinking about the gene to be a tall plant. We would use a capital T for tall. And that's the dominant version of plant height, tall. What do you think we use for the recessive version? A lowercase letter. What letter do you think we would use for a short gene?
S.
Everyone always says that, and it's not correct.
oh, what? L.
We don't use an S.
T.
L.
We
Lowercase
use
t.
the same letter.
Lower.
We just use the lowercase version.
That's not
Sorry.
right. That's not right.
Lowercase indicates it's the recessive form. So if we look at some possibilities, some tea plants may be pure dominant. What do you think that means? What two genes do they have? They're pure dominant. Nicholas?
We have two T's, two capital T's.
Two capital T's, right. What about a plant that's pure recessive? Right?
Two lowercase
Two
t's.
lowercase t's. The other option would be a hybrid, which is a big T and a little t. Now, if you think about it, would this be a tall plant or a short plant?
Like a tree.
Tall. How about this?
Short.
How about that?
Tall.
tall.
Oh, Mr. DeRosa, 2 minutes, can we?
Why tall?
Because
It's dominant.
It's dominant. For these characteristics, we're talking about something that's an either or. It's not codominance, it's not intermediate inheritance. It's either tall or short. So that would be a tall one. You only get a short one if you have 2 of the recessive genes.
Is that like grass?
No, we're talking about a specific plant. All right,
Alright,
let's finish this, and then tomorrow we can go over Punnett Square.
What?
So, when we talk about an organism, we can talk about 2 things. Its phenotype and its genotype. Talk about phenotype, we're talking about sort of the physical appearance. How do those genes show through? It's always going to be like a word, like a tall plant. The plant is tall. Her hair was blonde. She had blue eyes. The pea was wrinkled. Those are descriptions of the phenotype. The genotype tells which genes an organism has. Its genetic makeup. It's going to be letters usually. Big T, little b. Or it could be pure dominant or pure recessive. That's also genotype.
What is BV?
Blue eyes.
Oh.
This is not about plants. So if we look at this plant and if we still think about the height, what is this plant's phenotype?
Tall.
Phenotype.
Oh.
Tall. What are its possible genotypes?
Capital and lower
Capital
Capital or capital lower?
Capital.
Either one is going to give a tall plant.
What about
What is this plant's
weak?
phenotype?
Purple.
Short. Midget.
Short.
Man, you say purple. It has purple on it.
But we're talking about height.
Oh.